Fog crawled over Sierra Nevada like a slow, deliberate tide, curling through pines and settling over the Cedar Lodge Motel. Inside, a room smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpet. Ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of place tourists barely notice. But on one bed, tucked beneath rumpled sheets, lay evidence of something monstrous. A girl's abandoned journal, pages smeared with ink and fear, her final entries cut short mid-sentence. Names were crossed out, notes erased, but the panic bled through every line. She wrote of shadows that lingered too long, of a man who smiled too easily, who lingered in doorways just a heartbeat too long. No one knew the girl yet. She had no reason to vanish, no enemies, no motive for leaving behind the warmth of her family or the sunlight of Yosemite trails. And yet, by the time dawn broke over the pine-studded valley, her absence was a fact, a scream lodged in the heart of the park. For locals and travelers alike, the mountains whispered their indifference. The granite cliffs, the roaring waterfalls, the endless forests, they witnessed it all but gave nothing away. And as news spread of missing women and unexplained fires, a single question rose over the fog. Who could move through paradise and leave terror in their wake? The answer would come too late, but the dread, the sticky, suffocating dread, settled in for anyone paying attention. They found a notebook, its pages warped with age, the ink bleeding into the yellow paper like veins under pale skin. It wasn't the words that froze investigators in place, though. It was a handwriting, sharp, erratic slashes of a 7-year-old boy trying to shape letters, stumbling across vocabulary too dark for playground chatter. I think about ending them. It read, clumsy but clear, at 7. Cary Stayner wasn't dreaming of baseball or comic books. He was imagining what it might feel like to take life away. That single fragment of a childhood thought, whether truly written down or simply remembered later, lingers like a ghost. Because years later, in the Sierra Nevada's postcard-perfect landscape of pine forests and mountain air, women would vanish. Tourists came seeking escape, and instead, some encountered Cary, the motel handyman with the shy smile, the brother of a boy once taken by a stranger, the man who quietly carried a storm inside him. What makes this story unbearable is not only what he did as an adult, but the fact that the seeds were already there. When you trace his path back through family tragedy, fractured psychology, and the cruel accidents of fate, the notebook no longer reads like a chilling oddity. It reads like prophecy. And that's the horror. How early does the darkness announce itself? Was Cary's destiny already etched when he was scribbling fantasies at 7 years old? Or did the world around him, his family, his history, the merciless hand of chance, sculpt him into what he became? We tell ourselves that monsters are made in shadows, that their transformations are sudden, unpredictable. But Cary's story mocks that comfort. His trajectory was not lightning from a clear sky. It was a slow burn, a boy rehearsing images he couldn't explain, then carrying them silently into adulthood until one day, silence gave way to action. The case of Cary Stayner doesn't just ask what happened in Yosemite in 1999. It asks something uglier. How do we recognize a storm when it begins as a whisper in a child's mind? And what do we do when the whisper is ignored? The late 1990s in California had a strange duality. On one side, the world was drunk on technology's promise. .com startups, glowing monitors humming late into the night, and the cultural intoxication of progress. On the other side, California's landscapes still whisper their ancient indifference. The Sierra Nevada mountains, the granite cliffs of Yosemite, the endless forests, they stood unmoved by Silicon Valley's neon dreams. Nature had no interest in progress. It swallowed people whole and kept its secrets. Yosemite, in particular, was a paradox. Families came there for peace, for the illusion that they could step outside modern chaos and return to something pure, clean, almost spiritual. The waterfalls roar with the force of eternity. The trails promise discovery. The night skies bled stars and numbers city dwellers forgot existed. And yet, just beneath that surface, within the cabins, the motels, the staff dormitories, humans carried their quiet damage. It was never nature that was dangerous. It was the people drawn to it, hiding behind the postcard views. Picture it, 1999. Bill Clinton is president. Y2K paranoia is simmering. The world is perched on the edge of a new millennium, jittery but optimistic. Families pile into station wagons, Polaroid cameras ready, cooler packed with sodas. Yosemite was their sanctuary, a national treasure preserved for innocence. Yet, tucked away in the Cedar Lodge Motel near the park's edge was a man who didn't match the backdrop. He was hired for odd jobs, fixing screens, cleaning up the trivial messes of tourism. A handyman, easy to overlook. The culture surrounding Yosemite was shaped by trust. Who questions a guy fixing your door lock? Who suspects a man sweeping the sidewalk of harboring thoughts so violent they were practically vibrating beneath his skin? The setting lulled everyone into vulnerability. A resort community living off vacationers' smiles, unconcerned with the shadows that might linger after sundown. But the stage wasn't just Yosemite. The other half of Cary Stayner's world was Merced, a modest city in California's Central Valley, flat and agricultural, where his family lived. Merced wasn't glamorous. It was small-town America with all its comforts and its suffocations, and it bore a wound that defined Cary's family for decades. The abduction of his younger brother, Steven, back in 1972. That single event became a cultural obsession, the kind of story that eats up media coverage and reshapes a family forever. So, by 1999, Yosemite wasn't just another mountain backdrop. It was a place Cary had wandered into after decades of silence, depression, and unmet desires, a place that offered both beauty and concealment. To the tourists, it was paradise. To Cary, it was a stage, a backdrop for something he'd been carrying since childhood, waiting for release. Cary Stayner, a name that doesn't immediately snap recognition the way his younger brothers once did. Steven Stayner, the boy stolen at 7, the boy who miraculously returned after 7 years, the boy whose story became a TV movie, a household tragedy wrapped in hope. For decades, Steven was a Stayner who mattered. Cary? He was a background character, the awkward older brother watching someone else's nightmare play out in front of cameras. But Cary had always been different. Teachers noticed. Neighbors noticed. Tall, lanky, polite, but odd, the kind of odd that never sat comfortably. He'd strip naked at high school parties for no apparent reason, not out of rebellion, but as if compelled. He shaved his head during a nervous breakdown. He was obsessed with Bigfoot sightings, sketching creatures, chasing stories, clinging to cryptids like they held secrets only he could decode. He had fantasies about women, violent ones, that gnawed at him like parasites. By his own later admission, those fantasies started at 7. 7, the same age Steven was when he vanished. Imagine that. 2 boys in the same family, both marked at 7. One taken by force, his childhood stolen by an abductor, the other overtaken by something internal, darker, self-generating. Cary's scars weren't visible. They weren't newsworthy, but they were there. The Stayner household itself was suffocating. Their father, Del, was described as harsh, distant, a man who wanted control more than connection. Their mother, Kay, bore her grief silently, fractured by one son's abduction and later, another son's death in a motorcycle accident. Cary was left adrift in a sea of loss, an unremarkable shadow in a family torn apart by tragedy, never the focus of anyone's attention. And when the spotlight did occasionally turn his way, it burned. Imagine growing up in the orbit of Steven's fame, Not just a kidnapping victim, but a survivor, a walking miracle. Cary wasn't just overlooked. He was eclipsed. Psychologists have a word for what festers in situations like this. Resentment, not the petty kind, but the bone-deep kind that calcifies over decades. Cary later claimed he envied Steven, not because of the abduction, but because Steven got attention, sympathy, a place in the narrative. Cary remained the other one, the forgotten son. He dreamed of being significant, of being seen. So, who was Cary Stayner before Yosemite? He was a boy who admitted to violent fantasies before he even lost his baby teeth. He was a teenager breaking down under the weight of a missing brother. He was an adult drifting from job to job, never finding stability, shaving his head bald when his mind split under the pressure. He was a man carrying decades of silence, desperate to be remembered for something. When we finally arrive at Yosemite, when he puts on that motel handyman uniform, Cary isn't a blank slate. He's a storm that's been waiting 30 years to break. February 1999. Cedar Lodge Motel, just outside Yosemite. A cozy, middle-of-the-road place. Clean enough, cheap enough. The kind of lodging where families leave their suitcases sprawled on a carpet while they head off for hikes. On the night of February 15th, 3 guests checked into room 509. Carol's son, her 15-year-old daughter Julie, and Julie's best friend Silvina Palazzo, an exchange student from Argentina. They were there to see Yosemite's majesty, to capture the American postcard dream. They smiled for photos, unaware that those snapshots would later be the last evidence of them alive. The disturbance began not with their disappearance, but with absence. No one saw them check out. Their car didn't move. Phone calls went unanswered. It was as if the mountains swallowed them. For days, friends and family wondered. The park is vast. People get lost, people wander. But this wasn't wandering. It was erasure. The son's rental car would later be found burned, charred down to its metal skeleton in a remote area. Inside, investigators discovered the remains of Carol and Silvina, 2 lives reduced to ash and bone, the fire stripping away nearly every clue. But Julie was missing. The 15-year-old girl was unaccounted for, her absence amplifying dread. Was she alive? Taken? Lost somewhere in the wilderness? The unanswered question turned the case into a media frenzy. To outsiders, the violence seemed like an intrusion into paradise, an act of chaos that didn't fit Yosemite's tranquil image. To insiders, though, those who worked at Cedar Lodge, it felt closer to home. There was a staff member who lingered in memory, who seemed too close to the scene, who'd later confessed to being near room 509 the night it all unfolded. Cary Stayner was a handyman, a ghost moving through the motel corridors, able to unlock doors, to vanish into the background. He wasn't questioned seriously at first. Investigators were looking for strangers, drifters, the archetypal outsider who brings chaos. But this wasn't an outsider. This was wrought from within. The disturbance wasn't just a crime scene. It was a fracture in trust. Tourists realized the threat wasn't the wilderness or a cliffside fall. It was a man sweeping the sidewalk, the figure fixing the screen door, the one who seemed polite, quiet, even helpful. The devil didn't break in. He had the keys. The disappearances of Carol, Julie, and Silvina were a crack in the surface. What lay beneath was darker than anyone imagined. A hidden storm that had been brewing since childhood, finally stepping into the open. The fire-blackened car should have been enough horror, but the real torment was in what it didn't explain. 2 women gone, 1 girl missing, and no answers beyond the smell of gasoline and the silence of ash. The FBI descended on Yosemite because this wasn't just local anymore. It was national, the kind of crime that ruptures America's illusion of safe family vacations. The headlines made it unbearable. Tourists missing in Yosemite. It was the kind of phrase that forced every parent in the country to glance sideways at their own children, to second-guess every road trip, every motel stop. And then came the letter. Weeks after the disappearances, investigators received an envelope. Inside was a crude map drawn in an unsteady hand, alongside chilling words. We had fun with this one. The map led them to a location where Julie's son's body was found, discarded like an afterthought, her throat cut. The map was the killer's smirk made tangible, proof that someone wasn't just killing, but savoring the performance. This wasn't random violence. It was someone who wanted to be noticed. The letter deepened the mystery because it didn't match the suspects the FBI was chasing. They were looking at meth dealers, ex-con drifters, shady backwoods types, the stereotypical villains of rural California. But the map was too deliberate, too taunting. This wasn't the work of chaotic drug runners. It was personal theater. Meanwhile, the Cedar Lodge staff went about their duties under a microscope. Rumors spread who had access to rooms, who seemed nervous, who talked too much. Cary Stayner, the quiet handyman, was around, of course, but when questioned early on, he was polite, cooperative, unremarkable. The kind of man investigators barely scribbled notes about. After all, how could a brother of Steven Stayner, the boy whose abduction had once horrified the nation, possibly be on the other side of horror? Fate couldn't be that cruel, could it? The public clung to theories. Maybe Julie had been abducted for ransom. Maybe the killings were connected to a larger ring. Maybe it was a serial predator moving through national parks. Every day that passed without answers sharpened the fear. People wanted the culprit to be a stranger, someone alien to the community, someone you could identify and lock away, because the alternative, that evil could hide in a trusted face, behind a nervous smile, was too unbearable. But Yosemite has always been about layers. The granite cliffs, the dense forests, the valleys, all beauty masking depth. This case mirrored the landscape. On the surface, a burned car, 3 women gone. Beneath, a shadow spreading wider than anyone realized, with one more brutal act still waiting to break through. The FBI poured manpower into Yosemite, setting up a task force, combing through every lead with the urgency of people who knew the world was watching. Tourists still flooded the park, their laughter echoing against granite walls. But beneath the surface was paranoia. Rangers, motel clerks, even gas station attendants, all were eyed as potential predators. Agents checked criminal records, dug into known offenders, traced the movements of parolees. On paper, they were doing everything right, and yet the true culprit was still walking freely among them, fixing air conditioners and sweeping sidewalks at Cedar Lodge. Theories sprouted like weeds. The burned rental car suggested a cover-up, so maybe drug traffickers had stumbled across the women. Others insisted it had to be a local woodsman, someone who knew the back roads well enough to dump bodies unseen. A few whispered about cults, a bizarre but persistent rumor in rural California, whenever violence defied easy explanation. The letter with the map fueled speculation that multiple perpetrators were involved. The handwriting was strange, almost childish, making people wonder, was the killer mocking investigators, or was it someone hiding an identity too close to home? Cary Stayner was interviewed in this period. He didn't trip alarms. He presented himself as a helpful insider, offering small details about motel comings and goings. He smiled shyly, gave straightforward answers. In a case bloated with oddballs and red herrings, Cary seemed almost normal by comparison. That's the twisted irony. He was overlooked because he didn't fit their monster profile. Too polite, too clean-cut, too tethered to a famous tragedy. No one wanted to imagine lightning striking the Stayner family twice. But there were overlooked clues. Cary's co-workers described him as odd, distant, prone to wandering into the woods alone. He shaved his head during breakdowns, muttered about wanting peace. He even asked one FBI agent during questioning why they weren't looking at him more closely. It was a half-joke, half-confession, but investigators dismissed it. They were too focused on their list of usual suspects. Meanwhile, the theories hardened into a myth. Yosemite had become a hunting ground. The press leaned into it, painting a portrait of wilderness danger, of families trapped in some horror movie landscape. But the truth wasn't in the wilderness. It was standing right there, inside the human structures meant to provide safety. The investigation, for all its resources, was blind to the simplest fact. Sometimes evil doesn't wear camouflage. Sometimes it wears a uniform with a name tag, nods politely, and hands you fresh towels. By July of 1999, Yosemite's unease was no longer just a whisper. It was a scream. Another woman had gone missing. This time, it wasn't a mother and two teens on vacation. It was Joie Armstrong, a 26-year-old naturalist who worked in the park. She wasn't a transient visitor. She was part of Yosemite's fabric, beloved by colleagues, rooted in the soil of that landscape. Her body was discovered near her cabin. Her throat slashed, her life cut short with brutal finality. This was the crack that split the case wide open. The murders of the sons and Sylvina could, in theory, have been pinned on some passing drifter. But Joie's death, so close to the community, in an environment she knew intimately, pointed inward. Yosemite wasn't being invaded. It was devouring itself from the inside. Witnesses came forward. Someone had seen a blue 1979 International Scout parked near Joie's cabin the day she was killed. That detail should have been trivial, but it wasn't. It belonged to Cary Stayner, the handyman, the quiet one, the man everyone dismissed because tragedy had already cursed his family name once before. When agents brought him in for questioning, something cracked. Cary didn't just confess, he unloaded. For murders, every detail spilling out of him like a dam finally breaking. He described the Sun/Palazzo killings, the fire, the map, and then Joie. His voice was calm, almost relieved, as though confession wasn't punishment but liberation. For decades, his fantasies had been gnawing at him, festering in silence. And now he was finally seen. But here's where the breakdown feels almost Shakespearean. Cary didn't just confess to murder. He confessed to a lifetime of torment, violent thoughts since childhood, envy of his abducted brother, the crushing pressure of being the one left behind, forgotten, overlooked. He spoke of needing control, needing release, needing to carve out significance in a life where he'd always been a shadow. The FBI had been chasing phantoms, meth cooks, cultists, backwoods predators. And all along, the true phantom was Cary, hiding in plain sight, waiting to collapse under the weight of his own compulsion. The turning point wasn't just Joie's murder. It was Cary finally stepping out of obscurity. His breakdown wasn't a moment of madness. It was a coronation. The quiet handyman was gone. In his place stood a man who had dreamed of this unveiling since he was 7. The confessions Cary Stayner gave were grotesquely precise. He described knocking on the son's motel room door under the guise of handyman duties. He explained binding them, strangling Carol and Sylvina, and later disposing of them by torching the rental car. Julie's killing was different. Deliberate, calculated, almost staged for impact. And Joie Armstrong's fate, he told, was the eruption of urges he claimed had been stalking him since boyhood. Legally, the case became straightforward. He confessed. There was physical evidence, and the Blue International Scout tied him to Joie's scene. But nothing about this felt straightforward. Because how do you resolve something born decades earlier? A boy scribbling dark thoughts at 7 becomes a man who acts on them at 37. Can a courtroom verdict close that chasm of time? The official outcome was inevitable. Cary Stayner was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder. In 2002, A jury sentenced him to death. He sits on death row at San Quentin State Prison, a place that already reads like a hall of American infamy. Justice, on paper, was served. Families of the victims had an answer, if not closure. And yet, the lingering questions howl louder than the verdict. Could Cary have been stopped earlier? He sought help, admitted to breakdowns, displayed bizarre behaviors. He even hinted during FBI interviews. Half-taunts that investigators brushed aside. Was he invisible because no one wanted to believe lightning could strike twice in the Stayner family? Or because our culture is simply better at spotting harm when it happens to us than when it comes from us? Then there's the psychological riddle. Cary blamed his violent urges on childhood fantasies he couldn't control, on resentment towards Steven's abduction overshadowing his life. But was that explanation or excuse? Trauma shaped him, yes, but countless others endure tragedy without becoming predators. Cary's narrative risks letting him paint himself as a victim of circumstance, when in truth he made choices, each one devastating, each one final. The lingering unease isn't whether Cary Stayner was guilty. That's clear. The unease is that the signs were there all along. A boy dreaming of death. A man collapsing under untreated mental illness. A family ripped apart by one abduction, only to incubate another tragedy in silence. The verdict closed the case file, but it didn't answer the haunting question. How many other Cary Stayners are out there, quietly rehearsing, waiting for the moment they step into the open? The impact of Cary Stayner's crimes rippled far beyond Yosemite. Families who once felt safe in national parks began scrutinizing the smiling faces of staff, questioning the protocols meant to protect them. Tour operators upgraded security measures, motels implemented stricter checks, and the National Park Service faced an uncomfortable truth. Even paradise harbors predators. The idyllic vision of wilderness as escape collided with the grim reality of human darkness. For the Stayner family, the aftermath was a psychological quagmire. Steven Stayner, the miracle child who survived abduction decades earlier, now had to live alongside his brother's horrific confessions. Every media interview, every public recounting of the murders, reopened wounds they had assumed were old scars. Friends and relatives described a mix of disbelief, grief, and a kind of numb resignation, because tragedy had already defined them, and now it had doubled down. Culturally, the case became a cautionary tale. Documentaries, news specials, true crime podcasts. It was dissected, analyzed, sensationalized. Yet there remained a persistent thread of fascination, not just with the crimes themselves, but with the psychology behind them. Why did Cary do it? How do violent fantasies incubate over decades? The case offered grim insight into early signs of pathology, obsessive thoughts, behavioral anomalies, and a quiet accumulation of envy and rage that can erupt in catastrophic ways. Legally, the trial and conviction reaffirmed faith in the justice system for a moment, but they also exposed its limitations. Cary's story is textbook in one sense. Untreated mental illness, childhood trauma, escalating fantasies, culminating in violent action. But it's also a reminder that prevention often fails. Not because the warning signs are invisible, but because they are inconvenient, ignored, or misinterpreted. Families, educators, and authorities were left grappling with uncomfortable truths. The systems meant to protect sometimes see only shadows, never the storm itself. And for the public, the Yosemite murders left a haunting imprint. Roadside safety warnings, staff background checks, travel insurance policies. They all carry the faint echo of the terror that Cary unleashed. Every visitor to the Sierra Nevada carries an invisible awareness now, an unspoken question. Could something like this happen again? Could someone you trust, smiling politely in the lobby, be hiding a storm as old as childhood itself? Here's the unnerving truth. Cary Stayner's story doesn't have a trial or a prison sentence. It lingers in quiet spaces where normal life intersects with possibility, in the creases of our assumptions about safety, family, and the human mind. We like to tell ourselves monsters are obvious, masked, foreign, loud. Cary was none of that. He was polite. He was silent. He carried decades of darkness like a shadow you never notice until it swallows a room. Psychologists argue endlessly about nature versus nurture, but in his case, the line is blurred almost to the point of impossibility. A boy consumed by violent imagination, a family scarred by abduction, a life of quiet resentment building like magma under skin. By the time he acted, the landscape of his mind was volcanic. And yet, you can't ignore that at 7, he imagined killing. At 7, he rehearsed what the world would later witness. That is the part that lingers in the mind like the smell of smoke after a wildfire, unavoidable, suffocating, impossible to erase. The chilling lesson is simple. Evil doesn't always wear obvious shapes. It doesn't always break in through doors or scream its presence. Sometimes it grows quietly, nurtured by neglect, by trauma, by the very routines meant to preserve safety. It waits until the perfect confluence of opportunity and obsession arrives. And when it does, the world is suddenly forced to confront what it chose to ignore. Cary Stayner sits in a prison cell now, 30 years removed from the boy's scribbling fantasies in a notebook. But those scribbles, those early signs, will forever haunt anyone willing to look back and see the warning that was always there. The final reflection is not about him alone. It's about the unheeded whispers in all of us, the moments we dismiss as harmless that might, in rare cases, evolve into something unthinkable. The Sierra Nevada still stands. The forests, the cliffs, the valleys, they have not changed. And yet, every visitor now carries a shadow with them. The knowledge that human darkness can hide in plain sight, in the most ordinary faces, waiting patiently for its chance to step into the light. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.